Hello, Environmental Policy 1 students. Back for week 5, the topic of which is conservation of flora, fauna, and vital resources. That is otherwise known, of course, as biodiversity under the International Biodiversity Convention. But it's useful to think about it as flora, fauna, and vital resources because it helps us disentangle or disaggregate the broader concept of biodiversity. But biological diversity can be defined as the variety of species, the genetic variability of each species, and the variety of different ecosystems that they form. And so you can imagine that biodiversity is such a broad topic that it's a major issue in a number of different regulations and requirements that come into everything from building a house, how many trees can you cut down, what other environmental movement, what other changes can you make to that land, how close can you build to a lake, how close can you build to a river system, where can a plant be built, where can't a plant be built. All these types of issues are really issues of biodiversity. Draining wetlands as a farmer is an issue of biodiversity. Conservation of ducks, bees, butterflies, bears, everything relates to an effort to conserve biodiversity. And so the issue, like waste, for example, is a huge issue. And many different people who are environmental experts work in some aspect of conservation of flora, fauna, and vital resources. And otherwise, again, as I said, biodiversity. Biodiversity conservation, can be thought of as minimizing the loss of genetic diversity, and I think that that's an important thing to remember. Every time we lose a species or we lose a percentage of a species, we're diminishing the vital genetic diversity of not only of animals generally, but of that species specifically. And so that is one of the major objectives, to maintain genetic diversity. We're also minimizing the loss of species diversity, as I said. I mean, we have how many hundreds of species in the world that have gone extinct because primarily of human overpopulation and human impacts. Not only, but substantially so. And we want to minimize stress on ecosystems. That's another issue of biodiversity. How much of a lake can be crowded, how close can wells be made, be dug close to a lake, or septic tanks, or cottages, or any number of other requirements that go into everything from building permits to land zoning to use of farmland. You can see that there are just numerous venues where the issue is primarily about conservation of flora, fauna, and vital resources from the perspective of us environment people. So this whole area, like waste, is a massive area of work for young environment experts. But there are sort of three categories of conceptual framework for biodiversity conservation, or the benefits that biodiversity provides to us and why we want to conserve it. The first is ecosystem function benefits. The second is species or genetic use benefits. And the third is existence benefits. And let me just tell you what those are. Ecosystem function benefits are a very broad category, including things like the ability of the environment to filtrate pollution, to eliminate it. Nutrient cycling. Are we causing problems to the environment by generating too many nutrients, like in fertilizers in lakes and rivers that turn them into basically bogs? And climate control. Those are the ecosystem function, otherwise known as ecosystem services. Fresh water, fresh air, those kinds of things. Biodiversity use benefits are derived from exploiting species or genetic properties of species. For example, in pharmaceutical production, when we use plants for pharmaceuticals, or we use the genetic profile of animals to investigate different things, both for pharmaceuticals and agricultural production. And these things are critically important because these things are done all the time, and they provide an enormous benefit to humans and to other animals if we use them to protect other animals. But there's also sort of recreational fishing, bird watching, sport hunting, all those other benefits that, urbanites may kind of go, hunting. The fact is that there's still a large population of people out there who want the right to hunt, but that needs to be monitored in terms of species numbers, location, season. That's why we have hunting regulations that are only for one season. We have regulations with respect to not killing the females of the species, not shooting does. We have all kinds of requirements that come into wildlife protection. And then existence benefits are derived from the aesthetic enjoyment of a species. And it's more than just, that looks nice, but culturally, psychologically, emotively, we would be ill if we just lived in concrete jungles only, and there were no trees, no birds, no animals, nothing. And so we derive a psychological and emotive strength from wilderness, but we also draw moral satisfaction and a sense of spiritual well-being from our connection to nature. So that third category, while it may seem less solid, is actually a critically important issue. I mean, there's all kinds of studies that have shown the relationship between mental health and available environment, available space, this kind of thing. So it's not a flippant issue by any means. So why is this important to us? Well, obviously, for the same reasons that we have climate change and chemical problems and waste problems, we have a massive growth in human population. And we have a massive expansion in human population in terms of geographical expansion. And so we keep eroding the natural environment that animals enjoy, and we threaten those species' existence. We threaten flora and fauna's existence. We dry up wetlands and so on, and limit the habitat for birds, therefore put them under stress and so on. And so you can just imagine the things I'm saying, the numbers of people and numbers of venues where just a little piece of that is a major career path. People that just focus on, conservation of birds, or just focus on conservation of agricultural land and so on. A huge area of work, a very diverse area of work. And of course, in developing countries, the situation can be even worse because with overpopulation and poverty, the extraction of environmental resources is more haphazard. And while we can, in technologically advanced societies, we can be very systematically stupid about how we exploit biodiversity on a large scale. In an uncontrolled developing country context, for example, a poor village, I mean, I've seen it many times in developing countries where the entire surrounding forest region is basically deforested. Why? Well, because they need that wood for cooking, for heat, and they need the plant life for food, and they need the animals for food, and so on and so forth. So in an uncontrolled, an unregulated environment, biodiversity comes under tremendous threat. In an over-industrialized, over-technologized situation, biodiversity can come under threat, but of a different type and a different scale. We also see all kinds of problems that emerge with respect to trade liberalization. I mean, we have the creation of pressures for monoculture. For example, in some developing countries where there were very diverse, there was a great deal of biodiversity, multiple plant life, multiple animal life, and so on. What's happened to a lot of areas is that that's been leveled to the ground in order to produce export crops. So before a very diverse environment existed, now it just grows sugarcane or coffee or something like that. And so a lot of that biodiversity is lost forever. I mean, you'll never get that back. I mean, the biodiversity is gone. For all intents and purposes. If we left the environment alone for 150 years, some of it would come back, but we're not. I mean, the people are still there. So once that happens, it's very hard to regenerate lost biodiversity, lost genetic diversity. And so you can see that not only industrial development has had impact, but population growth and housing expansion, and then international trade has created some unique pressures on biodiversity due to the pressures of economic performance under trade liberalization. I mean, these people want to get in on the action. They're poor. If we grow a bunch of sugarcane in this 1,000 square kilometer area, we'll get some money from that. Boom, there it goes. Everything gets razed to the ground. I'm sure you've all seen pictures of the bulldozers in Brazil and things like that. And, once that biodiversity is gone, it's very, very difficult to reconstruct. We also have some unique issues with respect to the oceans and the seas. We're putting them under tremendous pressure for biodiversity, not just land-based species, but through destructive fishing practices. Climate change is having a huge impact on the oceans. We know that in terms of acidification and the bleaching of coral reefs. Pollution from all sources that just goes into the ocean, with storms, with runoff, with you name it. Introduction of invasive alien species. The Asian mussel in the Great Lakes, or the Asian carp in the Great Lakes. Underwater noise, anthropogenic underwater noise from ships and vessels and so on that disrupts whale and dolphin habitat. And mineral exploitation, oil extraction in the ocean causes all kinds of issues. And marine scientific research and bioprospecting. I mean, there's a lot of that goes on too. I mean, all of these things put stress on the biodiversity of the oceans and the seas that is largely remains, for all intents and purposes, remains largely still uncontrolled, even today when we think we're an advanced modern society. And lots of international efforts are now recognizing the importance of biodiversity. The Johannesburg Plan of Implementation had that on its agenda. The Convention on Biological Diversity, Convention on Migratory Species of Wild Animals, Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, that Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, all of these emerged to begin to tackle this issue of biodiversity, but it still remains a very difficult area of environmental conservation and regulation, and it's a huge area. I mean, you can imagine anything to do with regulation or the environment on oceans, on wetlands, on forests, on agriculture, on building codes, on zoning codes, on all of these things. There's roles for young environmental professionals to get involved. It's a huge area. And in shipping, there's all kinds of international shipping conventions that also relate. International Convention on Prevention of Pollution from Ships, IMO guidelines for designated special areas, IMO guidelines for identification and designation of particularly sensitive sea areas, and so on and so forth. You can see all of these in my notes. You can see the tremendous amount of activity that has to go in. And then there's all kinds of regional instruments that are for special zones that are particularly fragile for ecosystems. And in Canada, of course, we have several acts that apply, and you need to be aware of those. I mean, the Migratory Birds Convention Act of 1994. I mean, we brought that in because ducks and geese and all that were being slaughtered. Hunting seasons were out of whack. Habitats were being drained where they live, so we had to bring in an act to maintain that habitat and maintain the viability of the species. The Species at Risk Act of 2002, that's another big one. Wild Animal and Plant Protection and Regulation of International Interprovincial Trade Act is another one. The Fisheries Act was the big one that dealt with, it called the Fisheries Act, so certainly it was dealing with fisheries, but it was a major way that we got at chemical pollution. Our fertilizer pollution of our waterways in Canada. It has a huge history, the Fisheries Act in Canada. The National Parks Act of 2000 is another one, and the Canada Oceans Act of 1997. All of these are acts that all have a regulatory regime built. They all have environmental protection activities built up around them. So you can see that this whole area is constantly under pressure and is constantly evolving as to how do we improve our capacity to maintain flora, fauna, and genetic diversity. And so that's another huge area. So in this theme of the course, we dealt with chemicals, waste, and flora, fauna, our biodiversity. And those three areas, the reason I highlight those three is because those are the three that you're likely to bump up against most. If you worked in a municipal government, or you worked with an industry, or you worked with an organization or a consulting firm, a lot of issues will reside there. Yes, climate change is now being talked about as a huge issue, but that issue is largely going to be based in the technology and technology development to maintain or to reduce our dependence on GHGs and our dependence on oil and gas and the emission of GHGs, I should say. And so that will take on a different form. It's likely to take on a very highly technological development form, whereas these other issues are these constantly, nagging, ongoing, day-to-day process issues that we have to deal with, where a lot of environmental professionals will end up working in those areas, or they'll certainly be exposed to them. If you work in an industry, certainly chemicals is going to be managed. Certainly the management of the waste of that industry is going to be very important. And where that industry can expand, its land use and its protection of the surrounding environment, human communities, forests, agricultural land, species, and so on, are something that industries have to continually manage. Municipalities, it's obvious, right? We have to maintain park systems, hazardous waste collection, solid waste management, building codes, or how many trees you can cut down if you're building a house, whether a house can go there or can't go there. All of these issues relate to the environment, sustainable development, in one of those three major areas. So those three areas, I think you'll find, will be areas where a lot of you will be exposed to in your work. Some of you will get jobs related to climate change, but most of that will be a lot of that will be dealt with in sort of broad investment frameworks for, we need to acquire this new technology for reducing our GHG emissions. Yeah, okay, we know that. You're the environmental expert. You certainly know that. Then the sort of technology development and procurement folks take over. But these other issues are those things that need to be managed on a day-to-day basis to deal with environmental protection. So I think we've got a good taste of major environmental issues in Canada. Obviously, there are others. We talked about climate change, but there's deforestation, which relates to biodiversity. There's a number of other different issues that can be flagged, but certainly these three have been major ones. And so I'll leave you with that. Take a look at my my lecture notes for the different types of acts and legislation and international agreements that are out there. And we'll see you next week. Cheers.